Welcome to this presentation of our Immersion Week in El Paso and Juarez. On our first evening, we were shown the Twin Cities from above on El Paso's Franklin Mountain.
I had seen the poor in Africa and saw the results of the U.S. policies there.
I kept finding such conflicting news reports. What was the truth?
I watched the caravans.
The reports of children, including infants, being separated from their parents was horrifying to me.
I had been watching the reports of the migration from Central America to the United States.
Building a wall separates humans with artificial borders and also damages wildlife corridors.
How far would you walk to save your children?
The wall, the evil incarnation of vile U.S. policies. I wanted to see it for myself.
Please join us as we spend about a week in El Paso and Juarez seeking answers to the questions of our hearts. The participants of this venture are ELCA Lutherans in Northeastern Minnesota and members of ICMJ, the Interfaith Committee for Migrant Justice in Duluth. We chose the Columbine Mission Center to shepherd a 6-day event. Saint Columban of Ireland was an inspirational 6th century missionary and abbot. The Columbine Mission Society continues to this day, sharing the gospel of Jesus in many continents. Their center in El Paso hosts groups who want to learn about immigration issues. During our stay, we were able to meet face-to-face and heart-to-heart with children of God on both sides of the border. Of course, our trip was prior to COVID-19, but these are the stories we brought home.
Here is the enormous metropolitan area of El Paso and Juarez along the U.S.-Mexico border, separated by the Rio Grande. This is the Columbine Mission Center in El Paso, Texas, mere blocks from the border. Father Bob Mosher and his team provided hospitality and facilitated contacts with organizations and people related to poverty, migration, and human rights through the Border Awareness Program. In this presentation, you will get a taste of the wide network of these courageous and compassionate people. Here's Father Bob with his 15-passenger van. Father Bob drove us to all the sites we would visit in El Paso, Juarez, and Las Cruces, New Mexico. These trips also allowed our group time to get to know each other.
The Annunciation House is a volunteer organization led by Ruben Garcia that offers hospitality to migrants, immigrants, and refugees in the border region of El Paso. Since its inception in 1978, it has provided shelter, food, and other basic necessities for hundreds of thousands of migrants, mostly from Mexico and Central America. They also participate in advocacy and education around immigration issues and seek to be a voice of justice and compassion, especially on behalf of the most marginalized in our society. They treat each person with dignity and respect that they deserve. The Annunciation House soon developed the Border Awareness Program for people interested to learn more about the work at the border. The goal is to provide a deep and meaningful immersion experience for people seeking an understanding of the El Paso, Juarez community and the immigrants' experience on our southern border. We met with Ruben on our first full day, and he set the stage for what we were to experience for the rest of the trip. During Ruben's talk with us, he raised for us some disturbing, soul-searching concepts. He gave us some advice. If you want to engage with people and care about their stories, ask them questions and don't give them your answers. Listen to theirs. Ruben also challenged us to study the facts behind immigration and United States policies so that we could get educated prior to speaking to issues on the border. He asked us to challenge ourselves to look for the invisible people in our own communities back home and to think about what policies have made those realities. And he asked us, why are you here in El Paso? The issue is not the manufactured fear of refugees. Why, there is no wall on the Canadian border. Why are Pedro and Maria going to take from us? We would spend the next 5 days trying to answer these questions.
As we mentioned in our opening, many of us hope to have face-to-face encounters with people on both sides of the border in order to learn what is actually happening. We were not disappointed. Our first series of people stories help explain some of the effects on human beings due to current US policies on both sides of the border. You will hear powerful first-person stories of their tribulations. The second series of stories highlight folks doing amazing humanitarian things with few resources. You'll meet the leaders of those social programs, although you won't meet the invisible people for whom these programs are dedicated. First, Amy is going to help us all with some definitions as we begin our presentation.
Ruben implored us to learn and use the correct terminology when speaking about the issue of immigration. Each of the following designations or terms carries a certain legal status under international law. First, asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are men, women, and children who have fled their home countries because they fear for their lives due to such things as war or other violence, and their government cannot or will not protect them. When asylum seekers cross our border, they are seeking protection from danger and the right to apply for refugee status. Under international law, asylum seekers should be allowed to stay in the United States until they finish their appeal process in immigration court. However, that norm was changed by the Trump administration's adoption and implementation of the Migrant Protection Protocol, or MPP. Because of MPP policies, the women and children we met at the shelter in Juarez had been sent back from the United States over the border to Juarez to await their hearing. It now seems the Biden administration is working to end the MPP policy. Second designation, refugees. Refugees began their journey as asylum seekers, but are further along in the process. They are among the lucky few who have had their cases heard before an immigration court and have been granted refugee status. In addition, before they can enter the US, they are fully vetted. After that, they are protected as legal residents of the US by the UN Convention of 1951. We didn't meet anyone on the border that had achieved refugee status, only asylum seekers and migrants. You should know that it's very difficult to achieve refugee status. A claim of starvation, poverty, or natural disaster, such as a hurricane or earthquake, is not acceptable as a reason for claiming refugee status. The El Paso immigration courts confer refugee status to only about 2% of the cases they hear. Migrants. Migrants cross borders as mutually beneficial process. You know, we need workers and they need jobs. We need grad students and they want to study at an American university and so on. We have had migration back and forth across borders for hundreds of years. Migrants enter the US on a work visa, a study visa, or just a visa to visit friends or sightsee. The migrant farm workers that we met in El Paso worked in the Texas and New Mexico fields on farm worker visas. Although most migrants are here legally, some do cross the border without papers or overstay their visas and then are here illegally. Our first stop in exploring what it means to be someone seeking asylum began with attorney Anna Hay from the Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Services. She gave us a brief overview of the maze-like immigration process that asylum seekers and refugees go through in their effort to enter legally into the United States. We were given a handout of many pages complete with the latest immigration statistics and trends. It was a sobering dose of reality for each of us to find out how long the process can take and just how unlikely it is that the applicants will be successful. The Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Service is the only full-service immigration legal aid clinic that serves low-income immigrants and refugees residing in the southwestern United States. They began legal services in 1987 for Central and South American refugees fleeing their war-torn countries and undocumented immigrants needing legal assistance as a result of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. Anna shared information that refuted some of the most common misconceptions about immigrants circulating today. Contrary to what you may have heard, most immigrants are not in the U.S. illegally. 72% of all immigrants in the United States have legal status. Secondly, immigrants have a positive, not a negative economic impact on the communities in which they live. Immigrants at all skill levels actually create job opportunities and have helped in the rebirth of several U.S. cities. And thirdly, immigrants are not a major factor in violent crime. U.S.-born men between the ages of 18 and 39 are the vast majority of the U.S. prison population and are 11 times more likely to be imprisoned than immigrants. In fact, when the undocumented rate doubled, the rate of violent crime declined by 34.2%. We left there with our heads full of statistics and next would travel to places where the numbers became human stories.
We went to visit a shelter of women and children who are seeking asylum. Speaking directly to these women and children would yield the realities of what it was like to be asylum seekers. Our van pulled up to a steel fence and a locked iron gate, both protecting a humble cement house. Father Mosier on his cell phone announced our arrival. The home's manager opened the gate. We were led through a small dirt yard with a tricycle and basketball hoop. Once inside, we sat in a circle of chairs, joined by some young mothers. One child greeted all of us with a kiss. Children poked their heads out from blankets, curtaining 4 bunk beds lining the room. A young mother from Honduras spoke and was followed by another from Nicaragua. We were moved by their stories and tears. They recalled the threats, terror, and trauma as they fled in their home communities. We were disappointed and angry when they described their experiences with immigration and customs enforcement. When they reached the United States, instead of welcome, they felt unwanted. Their interrogations included physical searches. Officials showed disbelief of their personal stories, and the women felt ridiculed when they shared their vulnerable story details, which were their truths. As they wiped their tears, they described Teresa, their angel. She had found them on the crime-ridden streets of Juarez, where they had been sent after a 3-day refrigerated hold in El Paso. Teresa may be 40 years of age, herself a recovering cancer survivor, had established this shelter for 8 women and children. Here they were safe. But with each of them, with their asylum hearings spaced months apart, they were in it for the long haul. They may live in the shelter for 2 or more years and are unlikely to be among the 2% of folks who are granted asylum in the El Paso district. Embroidery, and we're selling beautiful handbags to visitors like us. They have found dignity and respect, fitting for every child of God. These women represent just a small percentage of folks awaiting for their asylum hearings. Most are in larger, dangerous shelters or are on the streets of Juarez. As one said to us, "We here in the shelter are the lucky ones. Outside, there are thousands."
Let me tell you about this remarkable man who came to the US to legally work before 2001. When the Twin Towers were attacked on 9/11, all visa work was put on hold and Jorge had no chance to renew his visa. He and his wife, both from Colombia, kept working. Eventually, while his wife was teaching, he became a Red Cross volunteer. His value and respect by the Red Cross was clear in that he was named Volunteer of the Year in 2016. He was honored by the organization that sent him to disasters around North America, including Hurricane Katrina, often transporting food and supplies. He told us proudly that once Anderson Cooper was in his back seat during one of Cooper's assignments covering a disaster for CNN. The most animated part of Jorge's story concerned the day he visited his 15-year-old son in the hospital. While he was there filling out paperwork, ICE found out and came to arrest him. However, his wife was able to call and alert him to ICE's presence. In what he called an out-of-body experience, he got into his own car and drove, with ICE in hot pursuit, to his parish church. The church and bishop promised him sanctuary, and he has been living on the grounds of the Mount Carmel Retreat Center for several years. His wife and older son have been deported to Colombia, but his youngest son, who is a US citizen, has been able to remain with him in New Mexico. Jorge told us how even the conservative archbishop was angry at his treatment, since the archbishop had been told that ICE was only going after, quote, criminals. Jorge is hoping that immigration reform will soon take place in the US so that he can leave sanctuary, be reunited with his family, and live and work in the US, his home.
We were able to meet members of the Border Patrol. The agent on the right, Officer Q, presented a pretty positive view of his 20 years on the force. He said, "We're here to monitor everyone who crosses the border between the checkpoints. We want to know who they are. You do too. Some 85% of the people we encounter in the sandy borderland are asylum seekers." He said they're happy to see us. They know that they will be safe from smugglers and coyotes and the harsh crossing without food or water. What we did not hear from Officer Q was that Trump's policy dictated that persons apprehended by the Border Patrol are to be immediately handed over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. ICE processes the migrants in a 72-hour refrigerator holding area. Warmed a little by thin Malloy blankets, they are then interviewed. Some will be placed in detention, very few sent to a sponsor, but mostly they're sent back across the border in that migrant protection protocol, which seemed to have no protection. The mesh wall you see here was built during the Obama administration. Barriers and walls have been part of the US policy in recent administrations.
Father Bob drove us to a large facility in El Paso. It was a private detention center. Getting inside the detention center as a visitor is nearly impossible, and even US elected officials have difficulty monitoring their conditions. Private companies that ran these prisons were guaranteed 80% occupancy by our federal government. They are paid housing rates of $145 a day per adult, and for children, $745 per day. It's a profitable business. There are at least 3 private detention centers in Minnesota, and the US migrant detention system bears the distinction of being the largest and most privatized in the world. This industry exploded during the Trump administration. Father Bob noted that groups often pray outside the walls for the detained and the discouraged, and for those who work at the center. This group offered thoughts and prayers as well.
One evening, we visited Iglesia Luterano Cristo Rey, a Lutheran church. Pastor Rosemary Sanchez Guzman greeted us. Born in Bolivia, she has served as pastor of this congregation for many years. She and the members are very empathetic to the plight of Mexicans who are still in El Paso after their visas or work permits have expired. Members provide Christian friendship and support to individuals pursuing avenues to remain in the United States. We went there to listen to Susana, originally from Juarez, whose husband's visa had expired. Susana shared her experience living in Juarez and in El Paso and her love for the congregation at Cristo Rey. 16 years ago, there was a murder near their Juarez home and they left thinking they were next. Fearing they might also be killed, they came to the United States with one child and a second was born in El Paso. Susana's husband was able to work many years with a work visa, but after it expired, he was picked up and placed in detention. Cristo Rey members arranged to cover the $6,000 bond to have him released from detention. With legal counsel, he applied for and received a new work visa. Bail bonds were up to $22,000 in 2020, and cases are now often administratively closed. They are worried that their case will be reopened. Susana's uncle, living and working in California for 30 years, was recently deported to Juarez, and now they are not able to see him other than 3 minutes a year at the Hugs Not Walls border event. This event happens as a result of this church congregation and with cooperation from the Border Patrol folks. Folks from Mexico wear one color t-shirt, folks from the United States wear another. Each family waits on their side of the border and then are allowed 3 to 4 minutes to greet their family members on either side of the border. For many, this short visit is the only one all year where families can hug and hold each other. We have a link to this event so that you can watch a short PBS video about it. We learned that the 2020 event was canceled due to COVID.
El Paso and Juarez have long been sister cities. Families visited regularly, crossing on one of the 4 bridges spanning the Rio Grande. Working, going to school, and shopping have all been interrupted by U.S. restrictions, with long wait times to enter the U.S. Father Bob plans for up to 3 hours of wait time when he takes groups like ours from Juarez back into El Paso. Prior to COVID-19, the drive into Juarez was unrestricted. The immigration stories we saw and heard were heart-wrenching. In thinking about extreme poverty in many countries as a result of U.S. trade policies, it became apparent that trade is one of the issues forcing people to migrate. Locally, trade policies affect people on both sides of the border. Father Bob had arranged for 2 trips into Juarez and other stops in El Paso for us to meet community leaders who are working to uplift people living there. These resilient folks strive to meet people's spiritual, health, and educational needs. Some have dedicated their lives to better the life of workers. Their stories are astounding and showed us in real life how sharing talents and gifts can really help other people.
Across the river and viewed small concrete homes, often unfinished, lining the streets in one of the poorest sections of Juarez. We continued to go to Corpus Christi Catholic Church in the neighborhood of Nafta. Corpus Christi Catholic Church with Father Bill Morton. We arrived there at the Mass and met some of the congregations who obviously knew Father Bob. Mass was held in Spanish. That Sunday during Mass, prayers were included for a young man who had been murdered within the past week. A more joyful moment came later when all cheered for a young boy baptized by Father Bill Morton. We would soon learn how instrumental Father Bill, originally of Pennsylvania and also a Columban priest, has been in helping launch and support ministries in the neighborhoods around the church. The service included spirited singing and familiar liturgical pieces, the congregants were most welcoming to us, even though it was apparent that we were just visitors. After the Mass, music continued outside, and there were many good smelling foods and sweets that the members offered to us.
After the service, we piled into the van and headed along dirt streets to visit Christina Estrada, founder of the Biblioteca Infantil, El Buen Pastor, Children's Library of the Good Shepherd. Christina was a lay person with no training who spoke in Spanish with Father Bob translating. She told the story of this learning, study, and social service center. As a young woman, she was a worker in a garment factory, but dreamed of being a teacher or a social worker. She began fulfilling her dream informally. She started with neighborhood children, bringing them into her home and reading to them. When she was able to acquire some books, she sent them home with the children so they could read on their own. She soon discovered that most could not read. She broadened her focus and began tutoring them and raising money to send them to school. She had to work hard to convince parents to let them go to school because they thought it was more important to earn money than to have an education. A house across the street from her home came up for sale. It would provide the right facility for a library. Its first asking price was very expensive. It did not sell, and they accepted her cheaper offer. Christina took out a loan and Father Bill assisted. With the help of family and friends, the building was remodeled to its current state. When we visited, Christina had 38 children in the morning and 80 to 110 in the afternoon. Along with tutoring, she provides meals and snacks. Pictures on the walls represent the more than 375 students she has assisted over the years. At least 65 have graduated from high school, and several have gone on to college. Most of the children received scholarships from Christina to attend public school. Area families cannot afford the $50 semester fee for tuition and uniforms. She hopes to bring computers into her library in the near future. She continues to educate the parents, reminding them that education could mean the difference between being a factory floor worker or the foreman. We then pulled up at the Santo Nino Clinic for Children with Disabilities. Our photographer, Judy Gibbs, snapped a photo of Our Lady of Guadalupe, protector of the children inside. This had been Father Bill's house, and over time was turned into the Santo Nino de Atocha Clinic by the Sisters of Charity from Ohio. They created this clinic to serve parents and their children with disabilities. We were told that these children used to be viewed as a burden, but now the parents and the community feel the children are blessings. The sisters have been sensitive to involving the whole family in their child's treatments and therapy, and many parents have learned how to give their children therapy at home. The next project the sisters are undertaking is carving out space in the clinic for a preschool for their patients' younger siblings. Santo Nino de Atocha Clinic is just a small 3-room converted house, but it is filled with big dreams and exudes great joy.
Next, we traveled to a people's medical and dental clinic created to serve those without money or a little of it. Inside, we were welcomed by Dr. Mendoza. What a warm, Christ-like, skilled physician we experienced in her. Graduating from medical school in Mexico City, she went to work as an ER doc. She kept seeing patients with serious illness progression who, if treated much earlier, could have avoided loss of limbs, teeth, childbirth mortality, and so on. She began this clinic more than 20 years ago to treat the poor before they become seriously ill, offering doctor visits for less than $2 or some form of barter. She treats the neighborhood and beyond. Anapra is one of the poorest neighborhoods in Juarez. Very few people, if any, can afford to go to any of Juarez's clinics or hospitals. We learned that any child born at home in Mexico rather than in a hospital is undocumented and therefore not a Mexican citizen. He or she has no rights, no records, doesn't qualify for national health care, and cannot go on to high school. The clinic also serves as a birthing center and ensures that every child born there is documented. Opening this clinic to serve the poor has been her calling from God. She is supported by individuals and churches that share her heart and her hope for every person who relies on access to healthcare. Dental services are also provided.
We were promised that two elders, Father Peter and Sister Betty, would share with us the history that has led up to the current disparities between the poor and the comfortable in these border communities. They did not disappoint. Having formed Tabor House, a Catholic worker community with two others, they live among and serve the families of Anapra. For over 50 years, they studied and advocated for the rights of indigenous peoples in South and Central America. They described how the United States policies have favored corporations and dictators over democratic and locally governed communities. In many cases, the poor have been removed from the ancestral lands. For farmers, growing food, especially corn, is now nearly impossible due to the United States NAFTA policy. The day after NAFTA passed, the price of tortillas on the street began to climb to the point that today few poor Mexican people can afford what was once a cultural and nutritious staple of their diet. As we were preparing this program, the Annunciation House announced the statement of the passing of Father Peter. Father Peter spent decades from Peru to Argentina to El Salvador. Since 1995, he and Sister Betty Campbell have anchored Casa Tabor in Ciudad Juarez, a home for contemplation, education, action, and community service. Over the years, Annunciation House brought many participants of their border immersion trips to Casa Tabor to learn from Peter and Betty. We feel lucky to have met them. We were welcomed into their home, which reflected the people they had served in Peru and elsewhere. Their prayer flags signaled their efforts to support health, wellness, and women vulnerable to domestic violence and too many cases of femicide. Sister Betty took pride in her flowers and the outside gathering place she has created for visitors. On the back wall hung large posters of the murdered and disappeared, mostly women, in just the last decade. That evening, we were going to hear a presentation by Malloy, a librarian at the University of New Mexico. Betty emphasized that Molly's work is terribly important because the powers that be do not keep track of all of the missing and murdered. Juarez is a dangerous place for women workers, leaving home early to work in the sweatshops and factories before the sun comes up, where they're able to earn $7 to $9 per day. We were given slips of paper with names and dates of women murdered. We were asked to report their names to the wall and in holy remembrance say, presente.
Not all of Juarez is suffering such abject poverty like what we had seen in Anapra, one of the poorest neighborhoods. I thought about our own city of Duluth. There are a lot of folks hurting pretty badly there too. And like in an opera, those folks are invisible to many. Our food shelves, supportive housing, clothing exchanges, so many services for people who are out of sight of many Duluthians. Juarez's rich culture was evident as we toured the city center and visited landmarks, went into markets, and had ice cream thanks to Father Bob. We left the city center in time to head back to El Paso at a reasonable hour. Father Bob had let us know that it might take up to 4 hours to go through the checkpoint. On this day, surprisingly, it took us only an hour for our vehicle to pass through. This photo was from within our van as we waited in line to head back into the US. Many other folks were in vehicles and many more transited the walkway alongside, all waiting in turn to enter the US. We passed our identity documents forward for examination and got through to the US with little effort. Not everyone who was waiting in these lines would be so lucky. Clarice just mentioned that Betty kept track of the missing and murdered in Juarez, and a lot of that information came from our evening speaker, Malloy of New Mexico State University. She's well recognized as one of the top experts keeping track of the brutality and the killings happening in Juarez. She began recording the numbers because the police weren't. It turns out many of the police in Juarez have been bought and sold and are a big part of the corruption in everyday life. Molly thinks that folks can work for a just and loving society and can hold corrupt systems accountable. In order to be held accountable, the corruption and the violence needs to be documented. In 2010, Molly sent an announcement to a newspaper, which I'm paraphrasing. 8 people in all were killed in Juarez. 4 of the 8 people murdered yesterday were shot to death while they were working on repairs to a funeral home that they owned. 3 of the men had been involved in the past with something called the Blue Star Gang, but then they found this legitimate work running the funeral home. It was their former gang that gunned them down. By that time, in March of 2010, these murders brought that year's total to 540, an average of 7 killings a day in the first 3 months of that year. I have since done a little digging, and 2010 was the peak of the murders, and life in Juarez has settled somewhat, but is still a very dangerous place for many of its residents and visitors and folks awaiting their asylum hearings. Molly's information concerned us deeply and rendered the Remain in Mexico protocol for asylum seekers and refugees a life-threatening policy, especially for women. Our group is heartened by the new administration's desire to end that policy. And maybe even the women we visited in the shelter have been allowed entry into the US to await their asylum hearings. We'll never know.
We were given a rather inspirational presentation by Lorena Andrade, Executive Director, about the effects of Nafta and workers' rights, particularly those of women's rights. Lorena described what it was like pre-Nafta in 1994, when factories such as Levi's were located on the US side in El Paso. Workers, mostly women, could enter the factory at a young age and work for a living wage there until retirement. After NAFTA was implemented, corporations chose to move across the border to Juarez and other places for cheap labor, and 35,000 jobs left their neighborhood in El Paso. The members of La Mujer Obrera have developed a list of foundational beliefs for their community organization. First, they insist that the people of their community have a, quote, right to not migrate, but to stay and protect the earth and each other. Secondly, while the city feels this neighborhood should serve the industries, La Mujer feels that industry should serve the neighborhood. Third, they believe they can build their community by relying on each other, learning from their elders, and listening to their children. Lorena mentioned a metal open air recycling plant that was going to be built near one of their elementary schools, and the effects the pollution would have on their children and community. They organized the community to resist and were able to stop the recycling plant from being built. These women are dedicated and effective. There was also a cafeteria where we shared a meal together with another visiting group. The table was set and we toured the center while our breakfasts were prepared by some of the women employed at this new cafeteria, and we found the food to be very delicious.
Many of us were moved deeply by the thoughts of Director Carlos Morentas at the Farm Workers Center. He shared with us just how important migrant farm workers are in the production of food in the United States. Migrant workers have legal status to work within the U.S. and with international laws. They cannot be used as slave labor. In fact, Mexican and other migrant laborers pick more than 90% of all the fruits and vegetables in the United States, and they are recruited daily at places like the Farm Workers Center. Migrant workers are exposed to chemical use on crops as well as poor working conditions and low wages. They are not paid hourly, but by the quantity they pick. They tend to lack housing and are denied medical assistance if they are injured on the job. This center serves as a place where workers can find out about new job opportunities, catch some sleep, get a shower, and get a hot meal, often their only meal of the day. Carlos talked a lot about food systems, and some of us were reminded of Ruben Garcia's charge to go home and make changes there. When we buy organic products, it means that those workers picking food aren't subject to pesticides. Carlos left us with the thought, fresh fruit and vegetables are a multi-million-dollar business. So why do we exploit these workers? Fields in New Mexico where many migrant workers from the El Paso, Juarez area work produce 2/3 of all the chilies consumed in the United States. Each picked bucket of chilies pays 70 cents. It takes 100 buckets of chilies a day to equal a wage of $60 to $70 a day. Average annual income for these chili packers is just $7,000.
Poster hung on the wall at the Columbine Mission Center. As we began contemplating the end of our time on this trip to the border, we did a lot of reflection. The quote on this poster is from Dom Helder Camara, a Brazilian Catholic archbishop and an advocate for liberation theology. I'll read it to you since it's kind of difficult to see on the slide. Quote, "These folks are not poor because they do not work, but because they are hardworking, and the riches that are produced remain in the hands of a few. Do not block your ears. You know and understand this," end quote. These words made a lot of sense when we thought back to Ruben's challenges to us, and also what we had just learned at the Mujer Obrera Cooperative and the Migrant Workers Center. You might be more familiar with another of Archbishop Camara's quotes. Quote, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask, why are these people poor? They call me a communist."
We gathered each morning and evening in the chapel at the Columbine Mission Center. Meals were shared throughout the week in the dining room, next to the mural of the beloved leader and defender of the poor, Archbishop Oscar Romero. Recently sainted, Bishop Romero had been murdered in a chapel in El Salvador in 1980 as he was presiding at Mass. Not too long before, he had asked the dictator's armed soldiers, who happened to be standing at the back of the sanctuary, "Lay down your arms and join with the poor." We stood together on our last morning, having been blessed by so many kindred spirits of Oscar Romero's. We shared our thank yous and goodbyes, knowing Judy and Amy were already aboard their early flight back to Duluth.
It's difficult to put into words all that we experienced in El Paso, Juarez. Due to COVID, we were unable to share this story in person, but hope that our presentation gives you an overview of what we learned and felt, how profoundly we were affected by the people that we met, how we were humbled by the hospitality that was extended to us, that the suffering and degradation of human lives caught up in our immigration system is very real, that the formation of community is the most powerful way to combat injustice. And finally, how questions we were asked about that injustice we saw still haunt us. Father Bob told us during one of our last gatherings for reflection that the church is learning that its core teachings and its authentic future rests in the hands, the hearts, and the wisdom of people like our neighbors that we met in El Paso, Juarez. And now we'd like to share a few closing thoughts.
If you have come to help me, you can go home again. But if you see my struggles as part of your own survival, then perhaps we can work together. Quote from Lila Watson.
Thank you to our neighbors in El Paso and Juarez.
And thank you for listening to our presentation of their stories.
If you are interested in joining a future immersion trip to the border, tentatively scheduled for January 2022, or you want to join us in the ongoing discussion on immigration, please send your name and contact info to El Paso Immersion Experience to Tom Anderson or Amy Loken at the email addresses listed below on the screen.
We have pasted a list of resources into the chat, which you can download with this program. We have also included the contact information for some of our elected officials. Thanks again.